Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural conference of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network. We are so excited to have over 300 SBAN members and non-members here in the room today to join us in this inaugural event. My name is Dr. Willow Lung-Amam. I am director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, and I am also Associate Professor of Urban Studies at the University of Maryland, where I hold the other hat as Director of Community Development at the National Smart Growth Center for Research and Education, where SBAN is housed. I am here and joined today by an incredible staff and also our senior leaders and board members from the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network that I hope you will all have a chance to meet today. So if you are out there, please say hi in the chat to the folks in the room today. Why are we here? Well, small businesses, particularly BIPOC and immigrant-owned small businesses, are incredibly vulnerable to displacement and financial strains when communities gentrify. We know that commercial redlining and underinvestment of these communities has historically left these neighborhoods underinvested, with fewer retail establishments and more small businesses and less diverse retailers. But as these neighborhoods gentrify, small businesses become vulnerable as chain retailers and boutique businesses that cater to higher income customers often replace these small locally owned businesses as competition and commercial rents rise. COVID-19 has compounded these vulnerabilities and have hit disadvantaged small businesses the hardest. Gentrification pressures have intensified in large and small cities during this economic downturn. And as communities struggle to respond and additional resources have become available to help them do so, effective interventions must now address how gentrification intersects with and exacerbates and adds to these business challenges. While we know that cities have adopted many innovative strategies and tools to prevent small business displacement, these efforts are both limited and not connected to policy advocates on the ground. Here at the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, we have built a national network that unites policymakers, local and national nonprofits, technical assistance providers, scholars, government agencies, and leaders, and small business owners themselves around the issue of small business displacement. Together, we're establishing and sustaining a network of organizations that work to prevent the displacement of BIPOC and immigrant-owned small businesses in gentrifying neighborhoods. We believe we are the first national project focused on small business displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods. And that by building cross-sector partnerships in different metropolitan regions around the nation, we're helping small businesses to become more resilient in the face of change and benefit from new neighborhood investments. We support our member organizations that work throughout the nation and internationally with coaching, networking, research, professional development, and experiential learning activities. We help to facilitate connections and learning across our network through in-person and virtual events like today. Our members work to develop innovative new policy ideas through our anti-displacement working groups, through case study research, which you'll hear about today, and through convenings like today, as well as direct advocacy. We are over 100 member organizations strong, 3/4 of which work directly with BIPOC, immigrant-owned, and women-owned businesses, most of whom identify as having low to moderate incomes. Half of them work with over 100 businesses annually. Most of our members themselves identify as BIPOC and occupy leadership roles within important agencies and organizations that are doing this work. So today's inaugural conference is an opportunity to bring some of those member organizations, but also to open up our network and knowledge sharing and efforts to strategize for policy and change to a larger audience that is dedicated to our mission and that are doing the important work of keeping small businesses in place. What we want you to get out of today's conference is new data about small businesses and gentrification, research about commercial gentrification. We want you to learn new strategies and tools to prevent small business displacement. Learn about how anti-displacement tools are being applied in different municipalities and regions across the country and even internationally. And think about how you can put some of these anti-displacement policies and ideas into action. How to apply some of the knowledge and resources you've gained to advance your own anti-displacement work. And we want you to connect with people and organizations, some of whom you probably know in the room today and have collaborated with, but perhaps some that you don't. So while we wish we were here in person to connect with you all, our staff has been planning an incredible 2 days. We have keynotes and panels with some of the leading small business and gentrification experts in the nation and around the world. We're going to be spotlighting some case studies to highlight work that small business leaders are doing to prevent commercial gentrification in communities. We're going to be having lots of networking opportunities to meet with your fellow attendees, and we're going to be having sound baths and poetry readings and even a virtual happy hour so that we can relax and celebrate the hard work that we know that you all do. True to our mission, this conference has been put together by a Black and women-led conference planning team and all other BIPOC-owned small businesses. So I want to give a special shout out and thank you to In Rare Forms. Adia, Jasmine, and Kana are behind the scenes and have been here every step of the way in planning this conference. So just a couple other housekeeping notes, and to help you get the most out of your conference experience, we hope that you all are busy updating your profiles so that people can get to know a little bit more about you and participating in the icebreakers. We want you to build community here by engaging directly with people. So please use those community boards to share resources and directly connect with each other and our staff. Stay for our speed networking and our happy hour events so you can get to spend time one-on-one with some other conference participants in a more casual atmosphere. And feel free to directly message participants and figure out how you can stay connected after the conference tomorrow. We want you to share highlights from today's conference on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram at the hashtag SBAN Conference 2022. And we want you to use those Uber Eats vouchers that hopefully you all have gotten to support BIPOC and immigrant-owned businesses in your neighborhood. Remember that those are good until Friday night, so use it to join both of our lunches and our virtual happy hour and toast each other. We want you to take that attendee survey that you see popping up in your screens, which will tell you a little bit more about who's here and in the room. And of course, we want to share those highlights back with you so you can get to know a little bit more about the conference attendees. And most importantly, we want you all to sit back, relax, and get ready to engage and celebrate the hard work that we know you all do to keep small businesses in place. We know that this is a particularly troubled time. Many of you may have been up last night, like myself, watching the elections. And we want to make sure to both celebrate and rejuvenate for the hard work ahead. So now I have the unique pleasure of introducing someone who has given us at the Small Business Anti-Displacement and incredible support, Cate Costa, who is the Vice President of Global Philanthropy at JPMorgan Chase & Company. The Small Business Forward program, which she helped to launch, is the primary sponsor of SBAN. JPMorgan Chase & Company is a global leader in corporate philanthropy that has invested nearly $350 million a year in communities and nonprofit organizations in 37 countries across the globe. As I mentioned, she helped to launch Small Business Forward, the firm's $350 million global philanthropic initiative to connect underserved small businesses with capital, targeted technical assistance, and support networks that help them grow and strengthen local economies. And she also manages a portfolio of grant making in support of the initiative. Cate, thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here again. Kate Costa. I'm a vice president and program officer at JPMorgan Chase and Company, leading our small business grant making across the globe. I know that there is an incredibly robust agenda and a wonderful, amazing people that we want to have time to spend with throughout the day. So I'm going to try to keep my comments brief, but I wanted to just take a moment to explain a little bit about why myself and why the firm we're really interested in this work. So our approach to supporting small business growth through our philanthropy is really based around equity, which means parity, which means we want to help ensure that businesses owned by people of color and immigrants are able to grow to the size that that business owner wants them to be, not grow to the size that the resources that are currently available to them limits them to. So when we think about that, we really focus not on all types of entrepreneurial activity that might provide, say, supplemental income or even income replacement, but true business ownership. And while that might look the same at the very beginning, what our goal is to make sure that any of those friction points that would prevent entrepreneurs from being able to build the business that they want to build, we're helping to eliminate. So the way our team is structured is we have folks that have subject matter expertise and work across geographies. We also have folks that have geographic focuses and work across subject matters. And so since I do all small business all the time, one of my roles is to really get the pulse of what's happening in local communities and figure out what the systemic piece of that is, and if there's anything that we could do from a national or global level to help address those problems. And this project was really born out of that process because as I was speaking to my colleagues in city after city after city, folks were saying, you know, this commercial real estate component, this actual storefront, this displacement from gentrification, we talk about it on our housing work, but we're not really talking about it with our small business work. And it's really impacting the small businesses that I'm trying to serve. So what can we do about it? And so that is what prompted me to reach out to Willow and her team and figure out how to approach this project. And from a personal perspective, as a Latina, this is important to me and my family members and friends and community. From a JPMorgan perspective, we're really interested in this because it interconnects all of these really messy components that contribute to the slower growth of businesses owned by people of color and immigrants. And this approach that Willow and her team has put together is really exciting to us for a couple of key reasons. The first is that the approach is really poking at both the systemic and the local, right? These are issues that are super personal, super local. We're talking about neighborhoods. Sometimes we're talking about individual blocks. You can't just come in from on high and be like, here's what to do. It's not going to work because it's all about community. But we also know that people are really resource constrained and we don't want everybody wasting their time reinventing the wheel. So this approach of supporting the time for people to collaborate and make sure that best practices are getting shared, but also understanding how they need to be adapted to specific communities is really exciting to us. The other thing along the same lines that we're really interested in with this project is segmenting out the different stakeholders and who can do what, right? So if we think about all of the different players that are impacting the displacement of businesses owned by people of color and women, a lot of times folks will look at the problem and say, okay, well, I don't know what to do. And what's so exciting about this work is that we're learning from people that are on the ground as practitioners, making change and making things better, but then being very specific about, hey, if you're a CDFI, here's something that you can do to help. If you're a funder, here's something that you can do to help. If you're an entrepreneurship support organization, here's what you can do to help. If you're a policymaker, here's what you can do to help. So that people have sort of, much clearer next steps so that they can really take action immediately and move this project forward. So I just wanted to share how excited we are about that, about this project, about its continued growth, and make an ask of everyone that we are really interested in making sure this work continues past the current project funding. So as you're participating in this conference, We would love feedback on what else you think needs to be done and what you think could add to this project and make it even better. And then I will just say, if by any chance that California Powerball winner happens to be participating, please give me a call. I would love to chat about what you're going to do with that $2 billion from a philanthropic perspective, and hopefully some of it will go to supporting this anti-displacement work. So thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to participate, looking forward to the conversation, and I'll hand it back to you, Willow.
Thank you, Cate. Also, that Powerball winner, contact me too. All right. Well, I am thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Loretta Lees, who is an urbanist, internationally known for her research on gentrification, urban regeneration, global urbanism, urban policy, urban public space, architecture, and urban social theory. It's a lot, but Dr. Loretta Lees really covers all of those territories. She recently moved from the UK to the US to take up her new role as director of the Initiative of Cities at Boston University. But in London, she served as the chair of the London Housing Panel, working with the Mayor of London and the Trust for London. She's a longtime anti-gentrification scholar activist who was recently awarded the 2022 Activist Scholar Award from the Urban Affairs Association for her work. And thankfully, she sits on the SBAN advisory board. So she's going to kick off our conference today with an address on gentrification and displacement, its impacts on small businesses, and the place of small businesses in anti-gentrification activism. Professor Lees.
Thank you so much, Willow. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, SBAN, for inviting me to give this opening keynote. I've been asked to kick off the conference with an address on gentrification and displacement in relation to small businesses, discussing their place in anti-gentrification activism, drawing on examples from the UK, where I've just moved from, the US, and here I'm going to point to some of the findings from some work that the Initiative on Cities at Boston University has done, and also globally looking at some research that I've done on this outside of Anglo-America. So first, gentrification, what is it? Clear question for this particular conference. So the bulk of the gentrification studies literature to date has looked at residential gentrification, where gentrification is defined as the reinvestment of capital, the social upgrading of locale by an incoming high-income set of groups, landscape change, direct or indirect displacement of low-income groups, which I'll explain in a minute. So second, displacement. What do we mean by that? What is it? So the US urban planning professor Peter Marcuse back in 1985 conceptualized 4 types of residential gentrification-induced displacement. The first, direct last resident displacement. This can be physical, so for example, winkling, when landlords cut off the heat in a building, flood it or set fires to it, forcing the occupants out. It can be economic, so for example, rent hike evictions. Secondly, direct chain displacement, and this goes beyond the kind of standard last resident counting and includes previous households who might have been forced out due to deterioration of a building or rent hikes. Third, exclusionary displacement. Here, residents cannot access housing because it has been gentrified or in some ways abandoned. And fourthly, he talks about displacement pressure. This is the dispossession suffered by low-income groups during the gentrification of their neighborhoods. Now, in more recent years, other types have been added to this list. So we can now talk about, for example, phenomenological or symbolic displacement. And this talks about the disruption to people's life worlds, their sense of place, the unhoming that happens due to gentrification. And that's even if people are lucky enough to stay put or indeed to move back into a redeveloped space. So, and apologies for the slide, we couldn't get the lettering to kind of quite make it. But what about gentrification and displacement specifically in relation to small businesses? As said, the gentrification studies literature is dominated by work on residential gentrification. but there's a growing literature that's beginning to acknowledge the importance of retail transformation in effecting neighbourhood change. Yet often it's the residential neighbourhood that's first to gentrify, and it's its commercial streets, its small businesses that are second. Now, key to the emergence of studies on commercial gentrification in academic work has been the US sociologist Sharon Zukin's work, in particular her discussion of boutiquing in New York City, in which she called attention to the displacement of local retail stores and services due to gentrification. Looking at Harlem and Williamsburg, she noticed how since the 1990s, the share of boutiques, including those owned by small local chains, has dramatically increased, while the share of corporate capital, so the kind of large chain stores, has increased somewhat, but the share of traditional local stores and services has greatly declined. She asserts that boutiquing calls attention to displacement of local retail stores and services on which long-term lower-class residents rely, and importantly, to the state's failure to deal with this. So patchy as it is, the literature that's beginning to develop on commercial gentrification now spans the globe. So just to give you a flavour of this, for example, Mermet, who's focused on the Marais in Paris in France, links the recent reconfigurations of retail capital, concentration, internationalization, financialization, and the more generalized gentrifications that are being experienced in cities around the world today. And you can see they are quite generalized. They're quite similar in cities around the world. Hubbard has discussed retail upscaling and what he calls the spatial restructuring of retail capital. He also describes the transition from ethnic stores to gentrified stores, and in his case, in the British context. He says, many inner city districts became characterized by locally run stores catering to the needs of local working class consumers, especially those belonging to ethnic communities whose tastes were poorly served elsewhere. Such streets are characterized by ethnic grocery stores, beauty shops and restaurants, but also discount stores and outlets associated with more residualized forms of consumption, such as liquor stores, sex shops and betting shops, as well as pawnbrokers, charity shops and second-hand stores. But conversely, it is this local character and vernacular style that has subsequently been seized upon as retail capital seek new, more profitable sites for its own realization, exploiting the rent gap between current and potential land values. Indeed, what I would say is notable about the kind of newly emerging commercial retail gentrification literature is its focus on race and ethnicity. Ironically, the residential gentrification literature, which is much more long-standing, has been much slower to respond. So, how can we fight commercial, retail, or small business gentrification? We can begin by looking at the work on resistance to gentrification in the wider gentrification studies literature. Research on resistance to gentrification is growing, but a lot of it focuses on the larger scale, collective, politically organised and visible resistance, rather than more micro resistances that might be deliberately and necessarily invisible, for example, in an authoritarian state, or for the purposes, quite simply, of individual survival. I've argued before and would like to reiterate now that we need to explore the different forms that resistance to gentrification takes, and in relation to the cultural politics of agency. So to date, most of the discussions of resistance to gentrification have been in relation to residential property. Annunziata and Rivas Alonso provide a really nice summary of this, and their summary is very relevant to small businesses too. So they talk about prevention, institutional-based measures, for example, fostering public housing policies, tenants' protections, alternative planning tools to prevent and mitigate displacement. They talk about mitigation and legal bricolage, so for example, delay tactics, negotiations, compensation practices, anti-eviction, rehousing, buyout practices that can postpone the problem or move it somewhere else. So, for example, tools like eviction-free zones, etc. They also talk about building alternatives, community planning, squats, occupations, protests, and urban commons. And finally, counter-narratives, building awareness and strategic mobilization of collective identities, like collective constructions of sense of belonging and alternative narratives that are mobilized against mainstream discourses. The anti-eviction project in the San Francisco Bay Area, which the image is on the slide here, makes visible the nexus, for example, between urban displacement and more contemporary entrepreneurial, touristic, and high-tech related urban development. But let's turn now to look at some examples of resistance to the gentrification of commercial retail properties and businesses. And I want to begin with two examples from London in the UK, one that has won its fight and one that's still in progress. So there are two different campaigns. These are Save Neur in Brixton and Edgware Road in Westminster. These are examples or cases that I have supported and are continuing to support. In fact, over the past 6 years before moving to the US, I've been invited to speak at various events in Brixton, in London, resisting gentrification, particularly in and around Brixton Market. The Edgware Road case, I'm just beginning to be involved in. So the first one, Save Neur. Neur Cash and Carry in Brixton fought gentrification and even made the pages of the New York Times, where it was described as having the crammed charm of a classic New York bodega, but with a standout food selection that has made it popular with local restaurant chefs. In fact, Neur has been a staple in Brixton for over 20 years, and it is a vital resource to local ethnic and immigrant communities selling low-cost, high-end groceries. It serves 90% of the restaurants in Brixton Market and the surrounding areas. Save Neur were a group of locals from Brixton and allies who came together to oppose the eviction of Neur Cash and Carry in Brixton Market. The Texas property developer Taylor McWilliams, who already owned a significant slice of Brixton Market, angered locals in January 2020 when an eviction notice was served on Neur and the Shaheen family off to the right there, who own the store. Originally from Iraq, they'd fled the Saddam Hussein regime, and this is their business. So Joe Cole, who's an organizer in Save Neur, has said in an interview that Black communities were being driven out of Brixton due to gentrification, and that this amounted to ethnic cleansing. He said, "I've engaged in conversation with a woman who owns an Eritrean cafe on Station Road, and she said that once Pop Brixton moved in, it's become a box park of high-end bougie businesses with majority white clientele. She said that once Pop Brixton moved in, the police repression on Station Road increased dramatically to the extent that the police were harassing Eritrean men who were having their coffee in the cafe." Indeed, from the 1940s onwards, Brixton had attracted waves of immigrants, firstly from the Caribbean, when down the line Brixton became symbolic as a Black British place, then symbolised by the riots in 1981 that were in part a result of racial tensions and aggressive police tactics. And later, all sorts of different ethnic immigrant groups moved in, giving Brixton the moniker of the United Colours of Benetton as a multicultural space. The covered markets in Brixton, built in the 1920s, began to be the place for the ethnic minority immigrant populations to shop. With financial backing from the American hedge fund Angelo Gordon, Taylor McWilliams bought the covered markets in 2018 for more than £37 million, which is about $46 million US dollars, along with a popular nightclub and another property he planned to convert into a 20-story office building. McWilliams, just for kind of background context, had dated an ex-girlfriend of Prince Harry and was a regular on the Ibiza club scene as a DJ in the house music group Housekeeping. The Save Neur campaign cast him as the villain. During the COVID lockdown in the UK, the Save Neur campaigners infiltrated an online charity concert McWilliams was playing at. The activists dressed up as clubgoers until his set began, when they revealed themselves and began heckling and criticising him, with signs in front of more than 1,000 internet onlookers. Suddenly, club music websites were writing about the effort to save Nur. Meanwhile, the Shaheen family were preparing a court challenge to save Nur, and local celebrities like the chef Yotan Ottolenghi spoke out on its behalf, and more than 55,000 people signed an online petition. After a flurry of negotiations, a deal was reached. Nur would move to a new location in the market with a slightly lower rent. McWilliams has said that the online protests took a personal toll. Activists targeted his friends, bandmates, even his girlfriend. People whom he'd not spoken to in 10 years received angry messages. His manager effectively dropped his band after other artists complained about his gentrifying activities in Brixton. But the Save Nur activism has not stopped. Their anti-gentrification fight has extended to fighting the tower, the 20-story office building that McWilliams intended to build, and this is #FightTheTower. This time, their tactic is more legal. They've been writing numerous written representations in response to McWilliams's plans, debunking it as greenwashing, talking about the harm it would do to the heritage of the area, including ethnic heritage. And there's now to be a public hearing, but the date has been constantly pushed back and has not yet been announced. So let me turn now to Edgware Road. And again, this is the second slide that kind of messed up. Before leaving London and the London context, I want to mention a new campaign that I'm starting to be involved in, because Edgware Road holds one of the longest and kind of long-standing and most recognisable migrant communities in London. It welcomed its first Middle Eastern migrants in the 19th century, and by the 1970s, with that region increasingly unsettled, it was home to a thriving community of Arab speakers. The stretch between Hyde Park and Little Venice has been nicknamed Little Beirut and Little Cairo, with the lower end of the street having a high concentration of Middle Eastern small businesses, food shops and cafes, including numerous shisha bars. Edgware Road is located on the edge of and pressured by other gentrifications around it, from Paddington Basin, which has undergone significant regeneration over the past 20 years, to Marylebone, which has gone upmarket with boutiques and galleries in recent times. In fact, Edgware Road is ripe for redevelopment. Indeed, it's what we might call a rent gap, boxed in by other gentrification price increases. And to a kind of large extent, I guess, it's the final brick in the wall of the full gentrification of this part of central London. So Edgware Road is facing business commercial gentrification, where Middle Eastern businesses, food and eateries are being actively pushed out in favour of happy hours, sushi and stone-baked pizza at the expense of people of colour. Edgware Road includes communities belonging to generations of displaced people who arrived in the UK seeking a place to be safe and thrive. Now they're confronted yet again with another displacement. And I've started to do a lot more research on these double displacements that in particular immigrant groups are kind of experiencing off the back of gentrification. Portman Estate is investing 250 million in the area over the next 5 to 10 years, and it wants Edgware Road to be, quote, more cosmopolitan and less Middle Eastern and now. So this is a very urgent form of gentrification. So what kinds of resistance are emerging? Well, quite different ones. So I've been involved as a consultant on a film being produced by a BAFTA award-winning filmmaker. And strangely, this is going to be a thriller on the gentrification-induced displacement pressures being experienced by the Middle Eastern businesses on Edgware Road. The antagonist in the film is a British property developer backed with hidden Russian money. And the film shows the visceral and violent attempts to displace a Middle Eastern business and their fight back. Now, of course, I've signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't say too much because it's going to involve Hollywood actors. But significantly, it's also involving locals from Edgware Road businesses that are being forced out, who are also acting for the very first time in this film. And it's this ethical stance that's drawing on their first-hand experience of being actively displaced that really kind of attracted me to this case. Off the back of this, There's various organising going on in terms of other forms of resistance. One of the things is trying to get money to support these local businesses to stay put by tapping into wealthy Middle Eastern money, which is kind of flooding into the area in different ways. So watch this space, it's ongoing. So let's turn away from the UK and face ourselves back to the US. Now, given that this superb conference is going to discuss lots of US case studies, I'm not going to repeat that here. Rather, I want to use this space to showcase a report produced by the Initiative on Cities at Boston University called Gaps and Opportunities, Supporting Boston's BIPOC Small Businesses. The research in it is based on our annual survey of US mayors and interviews with leaders across 30 nonprofits, community-based organizations, city agencies, and others in Boston. And I think some of the results and some of the kind of findings are quite interesting. So during the COVID pandemic, from February to April 2020, there was a 22% drop in active small business owners, but Black-owned businesses closed at nearly twice the rate of 41%. Against this recent backdrop, the racial wealth gap continues to persist as systemic bias contributes to white households both earning more and having more and more valuable assets on average than households of colour. These gaps not only manifest in personal and household wealth, but in small business operation and creation too, making fighting gentrification even harder. Boston's fighting back, and it could be a model for other cities by moving intentionally and aggressively to close these gaps. The city, non-profits, government and the private sector are increasingly working together to try to remedy structural imbalances and redress historical inequities. So some of the relevant findings to this conference from the report include: first, participants said that inaccessibility to capital was a key challenge in Boston, both to existing and new businesses, and that this was the most acute for BIPOC owners. Although the report was not about gentrification per se, one corollary of this is that BIPOC small businesses are less likely to be able to deal with gentrification pressures. Of course, Boston now is the second most expensive city in the US, and most of the participants said that commercial real estate costs were a significant challenge for small businesses in the city. This, of course, relates directly to the pressure of what we might call a kind of hyper-gentrification. These costs were asserted to be an even greater challenge for BIPOC business owners relative to white owners. The report says, while few new solutions emerged during conversations, this challenge suggests the need for more scrutiny on rising rents and fresh attention to mitigate small business displacement in coming years. There was also a feeling from interviews that the city of Boston was a crucial player with considerable influence over small businesses generally, and the state of BIPOC-owned small businesses in particular. But there was also a feeling that the city was much more responsive to big businesses, and that's probably the case of most US cities. So that's just some kind of food for thought. So lastly, let's turn to a kind of global outside Anglo-American example. So it's an example of commercial gentrification in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I do this deliberately to emphasize, as I did earlier, that there are different types or kinds of resistances to gentrification. In 2018, I published a paper with the urbanists Sandra Annunziata and Clara Rivas Alonso, arguing that we need to open up what we mean by resistance to gentrification, beyond the more overt, visible demonstrations like Save Nur or the serial killer cafe anti-gentrification riots in London, which made international news, to consider more covert, perhaps less visible strategies. Strategies that in many ways can be encompassed under the term survivability. Along with a colleague, Bahar Sagliozu, we looked at this on a gentrifying street, Java Straat, in the gentrifying neighbourhood of Indische in Amsterdam. So I want to summarise what Mahmut, who runs a small greengrocer shop on the street, did in the face of gentrification. Mahmut migrated from Turkey to Amsterdam in the early 1990s. He worked hard to open and run his shop. Back then, the street was lively. There were large families, single migrant workers, and these were his customers. It was the golden era, as he called it. The neighbourhood started to gentrify in the mid-2000s, led by the municipality and housing corporations who sought to socially mix this ethnic minority dense neighbourhood, as they characterised it. In this policy context, gentrification was meant to serve as a tool, one, to extend the touristic and entertainment facilities concentrated in the city centre into adjacent neighbourhoods, two, to decrease ethnic concentration through social mixing by permitting tenure conversions that would allow middle-class Dutch households to move into ethnic minority-dense neighbourhoods. The Java Strat plan aimed to keep, weirdly, the ethnic diversity of the street, which kind of goes against what we think in gentrification studies, while improving the quality, look, and product range of the existing stores. But it proposed to abolish illegal activities that were concentrated supposedly in cool shops and attract new high-end shops into their place. The hospitality sector plan designated the street as a hospitality sector zone, aiming to attract high-quality restaurants and cafes, but also getting rid of coffee houses, grill rooms, doner businesses, coffee shops and brown cafes that sell hash, which were no longer permitted. As a result of these gentrification pressures, Mammoet lost some of his business as ethnic minority customers moved out and were replaced by incoming predominantly white Dutch couples or singles. The newcomers were not buying as much. The pressure of big supermarkets was growing and the rents in the street were increasing. There was already fierce competition amongst the small business greengrocers. So Mammoet decided to follow the trends set by bio-supermarkets, and he introduced specific products to attract new customers. The diversity of both the crowd in his shop and the products on his shelves tells the story of the ongoing gentrification in Indische. Decorating his shelves now are superfoods like goji berries, organic drinks, and the other foods that the incomers supposedly desire. But next to these are the 5-kilo cans of tomato puree or 2-kilo packs of Turkish tea, still demanded by the large ethnic minority families living in the neighbourhood. Mammoet has done everything he can think of to make sure he can provide for his family, yet the gentrifying pressure of insecurity is on his shoulders, and he doesn't feel confident about the future. The street manager, overrunning the kind of gentrification come social mixing of the neighbourhood, says that they're trying to keep ethnic diversity intact. She wants to assist ethnic entrepreneurs in surviving the change in their neighbourhood, more specifically in marketing exotic products and upgrading their selection. Based on an understanding of diversity, the structural impacts of gentrification, such as increasing rents, the social and cultural change in the neighbourhood, were seen then to be negated by the supposed help to keep people in place to stop displacement due to gentrification. So ethnic diversity in many ways was packaged afresh to ensure a kind of targeted commercial success, and in fact the success of gentrification in this street. And this is a very Dutch and very particular case of doing gentrification, but supposedly in an ethical way. We can talk about that more later. But finally, Mammoet had to react very quickly to the gentrification of his neighbourhood. He had no choice. What is striking about this story is that he is, at least for now, a survivor of gentrification. He's not yet a victim. But of course, the question remains open as to whether people who survive gentrification by adaptation are victims or not. Mammoet's resilience is an unsettled debate in gentrification studies. But as I've argued, the concept of survivability introduces a welcome perspective of individual action into this kind of field around resistance to gentrification. So more food for thought. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that this gives you a kind of more general framing for your discussion and gets the discussion going. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lees. This has been really fruitful. I am very excited to see this new Hollywood film on gentrification. I think we oftentimes have these academic discussions and don't put it into the popular discourse. So I'm really excited to see you doing that translation and asking some really provocative questions. We do also have some provocative questions from the audience. So one of our participants is asking to hear a little bit more on your perspective on the differences between anti-displacement activism or the effects of gentrification on small businesses in the UK and the US. And if I may, I will just add a little bit of a provocative way that I'm thinking about this is if you could explain a little bit more the differences that you're seeing in terms of the critical importance of race and racial equity in these processes, both in terms of the way they take place, but also in terms of the activism that's happening on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a really important question. So one thing is that the work on kind of race and ethnicity is a lot further ahead in the US than it is in the UK. And what's been happening over recent years is that both gentrification academics, but actually also activists on the ground, have been copying the American kind of way of doing things. And there's been recent debate now saying that actually, it's a completely different context. We shouldn't be kind of taking on board the kind of Spike Lee anti-gentrification discourse, but we should be doing it our own way because our history of immigration, our history of racial structural disadvantage is simply quite different. However, saying that, I think there are lots of things that are very similar. So the way that particularly minority or Black-owned businesses tend to be structurally disadvantaged in terms of money and funding is one thing that's very similar. There are the pressures where white middle-class in-movers come into what are symbolically Black neighborhoods, like in Brixton, like in the kind of immigrant neighborhood in Edgware Road. What does that do? What are the racial politics? What is ethnic cleansing the right thing to talk about here? And when that happens, the secondary effect of that is on the small businesses. So it's like the residential stuff starts first, and then it plays out on the streets. And I think a lot of people keep the residential and the commercial separate, but actually they're incredibly interlinked because it's the residential that creates the customers for the shops and the businesses, etc. So it's almost like when you're fighting this stuff, you need to be fighting both the residential and the commercial pressures at the same time, if that makes sense. But yeah, so the UK and the US are very different, but there are some similarities.
Yeah, and so you anticipated the very next question that we had, which is actually about strengthening our understanding of that link between residential and commercial gentrification and how we use that link to better make the case to the public about the need for more anti-displacement protections that can perhaps affect both.
Yeah, I mean, I think this conference is where this is at. So we need much more research on the micro playing out of the kinds of displacements that small businesses are displacing due to gentrification in neighborhoods. And to date, there's not been a massive amount of research done on that, certainly academically, but it's out there in communities. So community activists on the ground, grassroots groups know what's happening. And that needs to be brought much more to the table, I think, and put together with some of the work that I've just shown in my keynote that's been done on fighting back against residential gentrification. So, if you're going to improve affordable housing and public housing in the wider neighborhood, that will have an impact on protecting small businesses from gentrification. And I think the tricky bit is kind of meshing up this nexus between residential and small business and how it plays out. And there needs to be a lot more discussion at that kind of interface.
Great. I think we have a question more about effective anti-displacement resistance strategies. And you mentioned the example from Mammoet, that what was enacted there. How viable do you think the strategy is towards a long-term and continuously gentrifying neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. So one of the things I've been working on is the scale between this big scale collective action, like the big anti-gentrification riots in Tompkins Square Park in New York City in the 1980s that become kind of, international moments. They're on stage, Gezi Park in Istanbul. And then the reality of individuals and individual business owners who are fighting for their business to feed their family, basically. How can we bridge that gap between the large-scale pushback and the individual pushback in terms of resisting gentrification? And I actually think both are important. But I think what we haven't done, again, is be able to bridge those scales. But that kind of small micro-scale stuff is really important. So I've done a lot of work recently on planetary gentrification, looking at resistance around the world. If you go to an authoritarian country like Turkey, for example, if you're a small business in an Istanbul neighborhood fighting back, because of the nature of that authoritarian state, you can't necessarily be out on the street. It cannot be overt. Some of what you do needs to be more covert. But what has happened is those covert actions can come together and coalesce amongst different individuals and actually have real punch.
Thank you. I think along the lines of continuing to think about anti-displacement strategies, some are asking about why the focus is on survivability or surviving gentrification instead of thriving in the face of gentrification. And I'll ask also in that sort of thinking about those scales again, from the individual to the structural, when we're talking about adaptability at the individual level, are we also thinking about structures and institutions?
Yeah, I mean, survivability, as I've just kind of mentioned, is a concept that we've been working with in terms of gentrification globally. So looking at the global south. So for example, looking at the gentrification of slums or informal settlements and stuff like that. So it comes from that kind of development studies literature, which looks at people's daily fight to survive in the face of forces that are often beyond their control. So part of it comes from that. But I think what's really interesting is you can take that into low-income neighborhoods in British or American cities, and you can think about different ways that that might play out. So survivability seems like it's quite weak, but actually it's not, because survival, if you don't survive, you can't feed your family, you can't move forward. And there's lots of debates on, the difference between resilience and survivability or adaptability. And, in many ways, maybe we need a kind of new moniker on which to attach some of these new kind of gentrification resistances.
Yeah, thank you. And I think part of that new moniker, as you mentioned, is about sort of narrative change. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that we have is about sort of educating local elected officials, but I would say even a broader public about sort of the impacts of gentrification to change the narrative in ways that oftentimes gentrification is often framed as a good in neighborhoods and economic growth and economic impacts. So is there a need to change the narrative and also educate local officials and the public on some of these impacts in different ways?
There is, and actually one of the reasons I finished on the Amsterdam case study was deliberate, because I wanted to show how the state has been implicated in promoting gentrification, but also trying to promote it with this kind of supposedly ethical kind of social justice stance that, somehow by, changing your business a little bit, you will survive in this gentrification and actually you might flourish. But of course, that's deeply, deeply problematic. So yes, local officials need to understand the negative aspects of gentrification and the things that it does that are deeply socially unjust. But I think one of the problems is what we call this kind of, changing mindset. There needs to be a way that we as academics, we as activists on the ground, do that kind of discussion, because they're just not listening. So the research is out there, the research has been presented, but there's a blockage. So I think in my mind at the moment, something needs to give, and we need to be thinking, how do we get people to listen who don't want to listen, who either firmly believe that gentrification is the right thing and it's a positive process, or even if they don't really believe that, they're in bed with developers or big business or whatever else.
Well, what about the folks who have already been convinced that gentrification is a problem? Sometimes, as one of our attendees is pointing out, there's a conflict between affordable housing and tenant protections that actually could result in unintended consequences for small businesses. So are there any models that you've seen that have been successful in addressing tenant protections at both levels, both at the housing and small business, and that are thinking about these as intertwined problems?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. But there are new models emerging. So, for example, I did some work in Germany, in Hamburg, and there's a big new downtown development there on the waterfront called Hafen City. And they've tried to, from the very beginning, put these protections in place. So they've tried to promote having different income groups in this new build neighborhood, having different types of small businesses, from ones that sell different kinds of products aimed at different target populations, etc. But the problem is that businesses, neighborhoods are organic, and it's very difficult to kind of get those kinds of plans and policies in place to exist over a long period of time. And the tricky bit is getting, businesses develop over time, they change, products change, what people want changes. So I guess the tricky bit is getting kind of, some of these kind of anti-gentrification activities to kind of talk to that.
Yeah, and enlist different kinds of allies, right?
Yeah.
So one of the questions that we have is about enlisting particularly cultural heritage advocates as allies in this fight, and where you've seen them work effectively alongside other anti-gentrification activists as part of coalitions or otherwise.
I mean, I think coalition is the way forward. I mean, collaboration, certainly in London, in the stuff, the anti-gentrification work I've been involved in, it's the big collaborations between lots of different types of people that tend to have success. And it's, coming together, kind of, debating how we're going to approach this as a collective, as a collaboration, what we hope to achieve, how we're going to attempt to change minds. Is it illegal? Is it a street-based protest? What are the different kinds of activism that might be appropriate for this particular case?
And we had talked before about narrative change and the importance of education, and particularly towards changing the narrative about gentrification from a good to sort of thinking about the negative impacts. But what about public policies? Can you name some specific public policies that are part of effective anti-displacement network, or anti-displacement activism, either in the UK or US?
I mean, this is actually something I'm starting to work on at the moment. And what's really interesting is actually the US is ahead of the game. So there's quite a few US cities that have actually begun to enact anti-gentrification policymaking as part of their local policymaking. So cities like Portland in Oregon, San Francisco, different places that have kind of connected with scholar activists in local communities and begun to embed that in policy and practice. And weirdly, you wouldn't have thought the US would be at the forefront of that, but actually it is. And this is some of the stuff that I'm trying to kind of copy and bring back into the UK, which in many ways is much more aggressively neoliberal and financialized than the US is. But those are all sorts of policies. They're all very different. There are ones that are giving back money to people who've been low-income, people who've been displaced, which I think is deeply problematic. So it's just giving them money, but they get displaced anywhere. In any place, but they don't get to go back to where they're from, to putting kind of policies in place that protect certain communities from displacement. And of course, Berlin has been at the forefront of anti-displacement policy. And even that now has begun to kind of peter out around the edges. Is it become more difficult to do the longer it goes on. So one plea I've got is for thinking about these strategies for the long term, not just for the immediate.
Great. And sort of along those lines of continuing to think about effective policies, are there examples where city charters are an enabler or a barrier for protecting small businesses?
Again, I think that's very, very different. I know that some of the global work I've done, so for example, in Seoul, in South Korea, the city has become very proactive in trying to protect small businesses. And of course, Korean small businesses often kind of eateries and very small kind of stores that have a kind of tradition in Korean culture go way back. But certainly the Seoul has been very proactive in this. In London, via work with the Mayor of London, there have been various kind of strategies put in place in the London plan that's attempted to protect businesses. But again, it depends on what those protections are, how they play out in the face of global capitalism as it escalates in an environment. And that can be quite tricky down the line.
I think we have time for one more question. And so I'm going to ask about metrics and measures for preventing gentrification? How do we ensure that our metrics coexist alongside traditional metrics like job creation and increased tax revenue, new business formation, to come up with some anti-displacement metrics that really matter and help to push these policies on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, data is one of the big questions now in gentrification studies, in particular big data. So what's become very apparent is that, you know, stuff like local census data and stuff like that just is not useful for this kind of stuff anymore, that we need big and better data. So some of the work that I've been doing has been looking at consumer data, for example, supermarket cards, and you can trace where people have been displaced by the fact that their address changes with their card. And you can't do that via some of the more traditional measures like census data and other stuff. So I think there's going to be a new growth industry around tracing displacement using different kinds of data. But of course, the opposite side of that is that many of the kind of big business and corporations and companies are already on top of this, and they've been looking for the new gentrification frontiers using this very same data. So I think the tricky bit is to get lots of kind of data trained people in gentrification studies, in communities, working with communities and for communities that can do this.
Absolutely. I think at the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, we've been trying to find some of those data sets and data sources to really be able to capture the kind of commercial gentrification that is happening in cities across the US and internationally. And that data is very hard to find. So we've been putting some energy and attention there. So thank you, Dr. Lees, for this incredibly interesting discussion. Thank you, Cate Costa from JPMorgan Chase, not only for showing up for us today, but for showing up for SBAN more broadly. And so we have about 15 minutes before our next session. We have put together different sound bath meditations that you can take advantage of throughout each and every break to really get that refresher. We know that in a digital conference, it can be exhausting. So please take advantage of that opportunity to all of our attendees and join me back here in 15 minutes for our next session on Pay Me and Equity.